All right. So, what if a CBDC, a central bank digital currency, would only work if you had internet access? And what are some of the kind of pros and cons of this? And what does this kind of look like for user adoption in general? Right. And so, in order to kind of define this, I want to talk about what it means for the offline transactions, right? And so, according to a recent paper published by the Office of Science and Technology, offline transactions refer to exchanges of CBDC that occur when the exchanging parties can communicate with each other, but they cannot communicate with the transaction processor, right? And so, basically, these online only transactions are when the transaction processor is there and they have it, like there's a connection between them. It's kind of like that third party's there, and the ledger is all incorporated in this and that sort of thing, right? So basically everyone's communicating fine, your typical kind of transaction, much like you'd see with, much like just using like your debit card or whatever, it seems, right? Where it's basically like a typical transaction that we as users typically don't think about, but unless you use cash on a regular basis, right? And then there's that distinction, which I touched more on in another video for talking about more of offline capability for a potential CBDC, right? But regardless, some of the pros, right? So positive things that could come from having only online capability, at least for the system, is the online only model would not introduce vulnerabilities from offline capabilities, right? And so basically, if you had like if you were to have offline capability for a CBDC, maybe you would have just like an actual physical device, right? And so there would be, say, a trusted execution environment, which I've kind of touched on before, this like physical area in a device of like physical hardware that is where CBDC transactions and computations are actually carried out, right? And so if that could be broken into and then someone could possibly double spend or counterfeit CBDC in that respect, and things like that, right? And so there are flaws in the physical hardware or flaws that could be introduced, right? Would not be possible if the CBDC system could only work online because that trusted execution environment just doesn't exist, right? So that's one that comes to mind. It could also, again, it would prevent the double spending of the CBDC or the counterfeiting of it. And it also would not complicate compliance for anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism regulations, right? Because there's no, say if you have like a offline CBDC, then maybe though if it behaved in application much like cash, then maybe transactions offline would actually not be recorded on a ledger, right? And so maybe in that respect, there wouldn't be reporting problems for intermediaries, right? Because if trying to track the cash, and it just adds or it takes away some of the complexity that you could see by adding that kind of cash-like attribute to a CBDC in general, right? All right, so some negative consequences of this, right? And so it would lose out on the redundancy of the system. So like if the network or intermediaries had a problem and it could not function, if you had offline capability, there would be a bit of redundancy in there, also meaning like resilience in the system itself, because you'd have kind of like the system could still function to a certain degree, right? You could still have some transactions taking place, if the actual online part went down, right? Much like physical cash is today in like the regular in typical finance, right? I guess like you could actually like you could pay people in cash rather than swiping your debit card, sort of thing. It'd be kind of like a CBDC equivalent of that. Or at least that's an idea, right? And so this could also harm financial inclusion due to requiring to have internet connectivity. And that's one thing they always bring up is like some people don't have access to internet or whatever, and then they would not be able to use the CBDC because due to that lack of internet access. At least that's their argument in that paper, right? Also, the lack of physical cash-like properties of offline transactions could harm user adoption, right? Because there's some people who would prefer to not have their transactions tracked. Can you blame them? But And that would be a disincentive to use the CBDC, knowing that everything is kind of tracked in a way, especially if they, depending on who's kind of in charge of the ledger in general. Is it going to be run by, like for the American case, by the Federal Reserve, right? Or is it going to be more actually run by intermediaries, right? And that's just kind of reported to the Fed, or whatever the case happens to be, whatever kind of technical nuances develop in the system in general as it's kind of maybe pushed out or whatever, right? And so finally, and kind of I've already touched on this a bit, is the lack of privacy for some transactions, because there is none of that kind of cash-like privacy that you get, right, from physical cash, and that would not be applied to a CBDC if you could only use it online, right? But then again, you'd have to look into some of the nuances that come from like the data reporting, or what exact information is necessary for those transactions to actually occur. How do you verify people and things like that? All kind of other design choices I've touched on before, and so that'll be in a playlist. It's titled US CBDC Design Choices, and that'll be on this corner, I think, if it doesn't reverse it when I upload. But anyways, we'll see if I'm pointing in the right direction when everything's uploaded and good to go. But anyways, I'll put in the top right corner, I guess what I'm assuming to be the top right corner, is the video for having basically offline capability. So you would have both online and offline capability to transact CBDC in general, right? So with that being said, the whole reason I do these videos is kind of looking at different possible US CBDC design choices and kind of discussing them, looking at the pros and cons, trying to understand kind of the route each way that these design choices could go, and just kind of gain a better understanding of the potential of a possible US CBDC system and where that could go, and maybe, you know, some ways that and by understanding it better, possibly figuring out a way to put myself in a better position overall for what could possibly be in store, right? So with that being said, I'm going to leave this one here, and that video will be up in the top right, and hope to see you guys there.